Hello, my personality psychology class. Very sorry that we have to have today's class in this particular format, but hopefully what we can do within this 30-40 minutes that I'm probably going to have a recording here is cover all the stuff that we were going to get into in that class, and that allow us when I come back on Wednesday to continue hitting the ground running and actually finishing up this first set of material that we're going to be going over before the first exam. In today's lecture, we are going to be looking at more material relating to the psychologist that we talked about in our previous class, Carl Rogers. In particular, we're going to really hone in on his phenomenological approach to personality and also clinical psychology that he started to really champion near the later portions of his career. This particular approach that we're going to be looking at is definitely a complex one, and honestly, it's challenging to pin down in some situations. But we're going to do our best in this lecture to really try to understand the nuances of Rogers's phenomenological approach in today's class. One of the ways that I thought would be best to cover this particular approach is to watch a video and sort of gives an overview of how this particular idea can be applied to not only trying to understand the individual differences we see from person to person, but sort of the different takes on reality that people have. Because this phenomenological approach isn't just applied to personality psych or even clinical psych. You'll see it pop up in a number of different areas. So let's watch this YouTube video here that's about 4 minutes long, covering the details of the phenomenological approach.
Phenomenological psychologists see the person without any essence or fixed core, but rather as something that comes into being through their actions in the world. This is always in an embodied way in relation to others. For without our bodies we cannot perceive the world, and without others we remain nothing. Human existence is, therefore, more verb-like, with us actively reaching out into the world, creating meaning, rather than being fixed in a way that can be passively described, like other objects in the sciences. These ideas follow the work of existentialist philosophers like Heidegger, Sartre, and Merleau-Ponty, who talk of the person as Dasein, the there of being. Phenomenological methodology is qualitative, looking at people's perceptions of the world and developing our understanding of these as analysts. This results in a focus on experience and the things in their appearing. We do not seek to delve into the psyche or reduce people to information processing mechanisms, because for us the psyche is always something turned out on the world, and so only accessible through an examination of experience. With this, we recognize the ambiguity of the lived world. We do not seek to pin down and fix variables, but instead aim to recognize and reflect this complexity in our choice of methods. The focus on experience at the heart of phenomenological methodology results in a need to collect data of people's lived experiences. This may be through first-person accounts, interviews, or other literary sources. These data are then used as the basis of a phenomenological analysis, which involves the analyst initially attempting to set aside their prejudgments about the topic and approaching the account as if for the first time. Later, the role of the analyst is recognized more reflexively through their reflections on their influence on the findings. The data are then systematically examined for themes, which highlight the nature of the lived experience being recounted in as much rich detail as possible. The unit of analysis is the detailed description of people's perceptions of their experience. This represents a move away from the individual in isolation, as the phenomenological subject is embodied, living in relation to other embodied subjects and the wider world. We do not believe it is possible to disentangle the subject from these relationships, for this relational quality is at the heart of what it means to be human. As such, our focus is on the meaning of the life world in all its complexity. The phenomenological psychologist elicits descriptions of the life world from participants, and then seeks to explicate these further, producing rich and vivid descriptions of experience.
Okay. Now, I don't know about you, but that to me is a pretty full description of something that's really tough to boil down to something simple. That is kind of the essence of this phenomenological approach, one that has a lot of philosophical undertones to it, that's embedded within this a kind of existential approach to not only psychology but the world as a whole that really was championed by Rogers. What I'd like to do here is try to figure out what this actually means for a personality psychology class. In this new attempt to understand individuals the way Rogers did, he was looking to understand individual differences, personality, no longer through an exploration of your childhood, your past, all of the things that theoretically have led you to where you are and the needs that you're trying to pursue. Instead, he said, our behaviors, what we're doing, is more about the now. The way we define ourselves, the way we interpret our environment, and the way we decide to navigate within that environment at any given time. One of the components to this phenomenological approach that he talked about a decent amount was this thing called the phenomenal field. This sort of interpretation, construction of our environment in our world that we were theoretically doing in each and any moment. It wasn't that this was something that persisted with us throughout our lives as much as it was just kind of this constant ebbing and flowing world that we were creating within our heads to give us a better sense of what we were encountering, and in doing so, a sense of who we were, which was at the heart of Rogers's take on personality. So how do we apply this phenomenological theory to, say, any random situation where we're trying to explain how our personality might cause us to behave differently from somebody else? Let's look at this hypothetically. As we mentioned, the phenomenological theory suggests that who you are is a byproduct of your sense of yourself and the sense of the environment that you're in that kind of evokes specific behavioral trends or tendencies. Well, let's look at this situation where you've got a bunch of friends, it looks like hanging out at a school, having a conversation. A traditional personality psychologist would try to understand each individual within this situation by either looking for behaviors that they can see overtly that they could use to describe personality, or maybe even asking people, what led up to some of the things that they were doing in that situation from their past. We're kind of going to apply the old Freudian approach to understanding individual differences in behavior in this situation. What Rogers insisted with this phenomenological approach is that when we look at individual differences in behavior that people are displaying, we have to recognize that those behaviors that people are displaying are sort of temporary moments in time. They're ones that are based off of their interpretation of themselves, their interpretations of the situation, and sort of what they anticipate was going to happen as they acted in different ways in these environments. This is an ever fluid thing in his mind, so that maybe the woman on the right making some comment that everybody found funny at that moment, it could see that as a great opportunity to make friends, and this is a situation to create bonds, or they could see it as a situation where they're just holding on to whatever they have to try to stay within that group or popular or whatever it is. The important thing here is that their thoughts, their processes of how things are going in this situation are extremely individually based in this phenomenological theory. Moreover, they can change. Right? So her interpretation in this moment might be one that's positive, where other times it might take a more negative tone, and her perception of herself could constantly be shuffling as a result of just microscopic things happening to her in her environment. And that ever moving, ever changing world that we're sort of creating through this phenomenological idea, this phenomenal field that we were talking about, makes trying to understand personality a very challenging thing. It sort of also highlights one of the things that was a big idea of Rogers's, that if we're trying to understand a person's consistencies, we have to first accept that we're not super duper consistent all the time. There's going to be changes within us, and those changes don't mean that there's nothing behind our behaviors. It's just, well, the things behind our behaviors are moving. So how do we get at these moving things then? Well, in the phenomenological theory that was introduced by Rogers, his big insistence was that if we wanted to really be able to understand why a person did what they did, we had to embrace a couple things. First thing we had to embrace was this recognition that essentially everybody is right when trying to explain why they're doing what they're doing. Right? Their behaviors are going to be aligned with their perceptions of their phenomenological field. And more importantly, right, they were going to see their actions as a way of successfully navigating in whatever world they had created. And yes, this was going to constantly be changing, and we might have regrets later on when we reinterpret situations. But in essence, all of our actions that we link up to personality come from the worlds we create. And if I want to understand why somebody's doing something, I got to get in their head, accept that their perception of their reality is different from mine, that it's right in their minds, and I have to embrace it. It's probably right for them. And I got to figure out what their current view of the self is, because this is an ever moving thing. Obviously, to try to do this is quite the challenge, and this is where lots of people really struggle with this phenomenological field. Recognizing that all of us are coming from different worlds, all of us are relatively right in those worlds we've created, creates this kind of monumental problem for lots of psychologists trying to not just understand where individual differences are coming from, but use those individual differences for predictive purposes. Now, you might have noticed that we've mentioned a term a couple times throughout this recording, and we even mentioned this concept in our previous lecture that we had in class, the idea of something called a self. This self is a really big component to Rogers's phenomenological approach. In definition, it's just the interpretation of who we are and what we're like. The general idea is that our belief in what we should do in a situation and how to make sense of a situation is highly predicated on just how we define who we are. This self is theoretically a moving, adapting thing, just like our perceptions of the world around us. But wherever that self is in any given situation, sort of impacts not only the way we sort of understand our surroundings, but the right and wrong nature of our behaviors in each moment we find ourselves in. Now, this idea of just having a self was a critical element to Rogers's original interpretation of the phenomenological view. But it became even more critical as his idea expanded. We went beyond just talking about this basic thing called the self. He redefined this basic thing of the self as the actual self, so we can introduce new selves, new components around the self that became critical players in other things that we were drawn to do in different social situations. Once Rogers started really defining what the actual self looked like, he started to contend that there was also probably another motivating factor behind our behaviors that was a different type of self. He started to call this self the ideal self. We've sort of mentioned it or danced around it in our last class when we talked about this self-actualization that we're all trying to obtain. We'll revisit that in the next slide as well, but I want us to just first define what this ideal self is. In Rogers' mind, as we're sort of forming an understanding of the world around us and who we are, we're also formulating an understanding of what we'd like to become. The type of person we would strive to be, or the types of accomplishments that we'd like to obtain. The general idea is that while we're really establishing who we are, we're establishing who we want to become, and that driving factor plays a role in a lot of our behaviors. We didn't explore this ideal self, Rogers said we really wouldn't be able to explain a lot of the different random behaviors that people display. In essence, he added another wrinkle to his already ridiculously complicated idea of this phenomenological approach when he introduced this notion of the ideal self. But it was critical for another element to his idea that he expanded upon eventually. In addition to talking a lot about, obviously, the ideal self and the actual self, another concept that eventually got tied to Rogers and lots of later follow-up research is this concept of something we referenced in the last class called the self-actualization tendency. If we want to boil that down into something basic, it's our tendency to want to not only perceived as kind of consistent and who we are as a person once we've defined ourselves, but also be in pursuit of that ideal self that we've formed within our heads. That this self-actualization tendency isn't just about trying to be that great person. Thanks to the contributions of somebody we'll be talking about much more in the next class, Abraham Maslow, the self-actualization tendency that Rogers laid out was also paired up with some basic drives, some basic needs that we were pursuing and kind of played a role in not only our ability to reach that ideal self that we were striving to become, but in some of the day-to-day behaviors that we were expressing that maybe didn't always perfectly align with just our basic definition of the self. Some of the things that Rogers and Maslow talked about in their work when discussing this self-actualization tendency were what they called biological drives and cognitive drives. Biological drives being the kind of different things pulling us in many directions that pertain to just keeping ourselves alive and keeping ourselves thriving. Even though this might not be what you typically think of with personality, what Rogers and Maslow insisted was that some of our day-to-day behaviors could really just be whittled down to what it was we were pursuing to help us just survive. There was also a big need within this theory that to kind of just stimulate the mind as well as the body. Sometimes our behaviors weren't just about being seen in the right way or reaching this full potential. It was just to sometimes experience novelty or experience some type of fun. What Rogers said when exploring what we were doing in any given moment is that this self-actualization tendency and the drive to reach that ideal self is often paired with a need to meet basic needs and physiological needs and to kind of explore cognitive needs that might perk up at any given moment. He said, in essence, if we wanted to predict what you were going to be doing in any given moment, We had to look at your perceptions of you. We had to look at your perceptions of the world and test any different needs that you might have, because those things all swirl together to kind of drive you in different directions at any given moment. He also, in this theory, expanded upon what would happen if we ever did reach this ideal self that we talked about. Mentioned in their work this fully functional person that we theoretically could become if we somehow magically got our actual and ideal selves to align. And oddly enough, as we mentioned in our last class, this alignment not only allowed for our behaviors and our pursuits to really be easier to understand, it also created this emergence of very specific traits that both Maslow and Rogers insisted were a part of being fully functional or self-actualized. Four major characteristics that they spent their most time talking about are the ones you see listed on this slide. People who reach this fully functional status apparently become more open to experience, are very existential or spiritual, tend to be creative, and report living much richer lives. Now, where these ideas came from, how they concluded that these were key elements were, always unclear. I think this particular component to Rogers' theory really highlights how much like Freud and everybody else we've talked about, Rogers' ideas might have some appeal and they might be interesting, but we're really just much like all the other theorists we've talked about, simply ideas that sort of came off the cuff and from nowhere and took us on some pretty wild, unusual turns. I think this fully functional person example is a prime case where we see that the kind of random thoughts that popped up into the minds of early personality theorists that somehow made its way into the theories themselves and kind of continued to persist for a long time, even if there was no real research behind these concepts. Now, I think to understand the idea around the self and how it dictates a lot of our behaviors, we might want to actually look at one of the things that also put Rogers on the map. He was one of the first individuals to develop a very comprehensive way of testing out an individual's personality. His design was eventually called the Q-sort technique. And in this Q-sort technique, people were asked to try to determine their personality by sorting through a collection of preset cards that described prominent personality characteristics that people usually possessed. And in this sorting practice, what people were first asked to do was go through the cards and first just separate them out into characteristics that defined them and ones that really didn't define me, or like me and not like me categories. Then they were asked to, after doing this, rank order how much these characteristics that they presented as like them really were like them, and how much ones that were not like them were really not like them. And from that sorting, they theoretically could get a better sense of the personality characteristics that probably dictated a lot of the behaviors and decisions that people made. Now, we did actually eventually have this Q-sort technique evolve as Rogers' theory evolved, not just looking at the self, or what eventually became the actual self, but also other potential selves, like the ideal self, and ones that we haven't actually had a chance to get to in this class, like the ought self, which came from another researcher named E. Torrey Higgins, who we'll discuss in our next lecture. To see how this Q-sort technique works, let's try it out. So what I'd like for you to do in this next class activity is, as the Q-sort technique asks you to do, go through the list of traits that we're going to see here. First of all, categorizing them as you or not you traits, and then afterwards rank them by importance. How much these things really do match you to not matching you in the ones that you identified as you or me ones, and then how much the not me ones really aren't you, the most not like you, to the ones that are the least not like you. It's going to take a little while, so I'm going to go to the next slide, and I'm going to have you, when we get to this next slide, do this Q-sort technique with the video on pause. So if you can, just pause here for about 10-15 minutes, sorting this out. It should take you a decent amount of time. Remember, you're going to sort them in me, not me categories, and then rank order them. When you're finished, advance to the next slide. Now, my guess is if you did that activity, you probably got a decent sense of what you were maybe like by doing it, and maybe you recognize that researchers trying to predict your behaviors could glean a couple things from you rank ordering the things that were most like you. It's a little forced when we're looking at that particular activity sometimes, and honestly, if we were doing the true Q-sort technique, we'd have way more than just those 20 items that you saw there. But when you look at that particular activity, because not only can you see that it could maybe get a little bit about you, it also was pretty darn complex sometimes, and maybe even hard to rank order some stuff, and hard to determine really if those things were driving forces behind a lot of your behaviors, regardless of whether or not you labeled them as part of you or not. But nonetheless, this Q-sort technique, despite its flaws and issues that people immediately raised, did become very popular as a common mechanism that people could use to measure personality and compare people. As I mentioned before, when the theory of Rogers continued to expand into looking at different types of selves, he insisted that we could use the same exact Q-sort technique to determine things like our ideal self. Use that in an attempt to better understand why we do some of the things we do. So let's try this again. But this time, do the activity not for your actual self, or the one you sort of see yourself as, but the ideal self, the person that you're maybe striving to become someday. Again, we'll advance to the next slide, and when we get there, I want you for a second time to pause the video and go through the activity as much as you can. All right, so here's that list again. And again, this time I want you to do it for your ideal self. So first categorize them as me, not me, and then rank order them as to how it pertains to your ideal self. Please be sure to pause the video so you don't get advanced into the next screen before finishing this activity. All right. So what does this activity actually help us with? Well, again, it helps us understand a couple things. It gives us, I think, a better sense of how Rogers applied his phenomenological approach to trying to explain behavior, gave us some insights into how we might define who we are outside of the purview of just our day-to-day experiences. It gave us, maybe for the very first time, a glimpse into how there might be a discrepancy sometimes between the ideal self and the actual self that we possessed. This all was why the Q-sort technique and Rogers' theory started to be celebrated. It's not that his theory became more manageable. It was still this behemoth that was really tough for people to unravel. It was one that you could at least get your hands around when things like the Q-sort technique became a prominent part of his personality theory. And it gave us, for the very first time, the ability to not only understand maybe mental health issues, but some of the reasons behind a lot of the personality characteristics that we possessed. It went beyond Freud's idea of the unconscious, or Jung's concept of the collective unconscious, or anything else that some of the neo-Freudians presented that we've discussed in previous classes. That's why it was really seen as a direct counter to Freud's work. Here in this activity, you can see how Rogers took personality as something that was happening on the surface level, really a byproduct of the interpretations, the take, the just logic of the person themselves. It doesn't matter whether or not a person's Q-sort technique was done correctly when looking at it from an outside observer's perspective. It said that this was how people saw themselves. Rogers insisted, how you see yourself is way more important than how any person in personality psychology might see you. Because if we're talking about how you define your behaviors, It's more about what you see than what we see from the outside. This also brings us to another really important thing that Rogers accentuated in his theory. His notion that when we define who we are, it's not just about matching up our behaviors with our interpretations of a situation and our interpretations of the self. It's trying to make sure that when we do things, we're seen as very consistent people. We want congruence, a matching of our self-concept of our behaviors, because incongruence, the mismatches, cause lots of problems. It makes us feel uncomfortable, sometimes creates lots of anxiety, so we'll do the best we can when we recognize incongruences, like distorting our memories of things, or coming up with ways to rationalize we've done something in a different way, or even deny that we were acting in a way that wasn't in accordance with our perceptions of the self. But in all reality, being seen as consistent was just as important to many as being seen in the way we wanted to be seen. There's actually lots of research that was done over the years as Rogers' idea of self-consistency became prominent that kind of supported this notion. There's research way back in the 1950s that showed that when people define themselves with specific terms, their ability to remember those words, those terms, was much greater than their ability to remember words that didn't really match with themselves. This is something that's been echoed in later studies throughout the decades. One of the most recent ones was about 20 years ago, where there was a lot of research showing that how good we feel about ourselves can actually be a direct byproduct of us seeing ourselves as consistent and us seeing ourselves as kind of being reflected in our actions. Anybody who tends to feel like we're not representing ourselves well tends to report very low levels of self-esteem and mental health issues. That's a very blanket statement, obviously. There's lots of exceptions to the norm, but the fact that we find these things gives a little bit, again, more credits to the phenomenological approach that was introduced by Rogers roughly about 80 years ago at this point in time. You might be thinking at this point, okay, I've got it, right? I understand that your personality or anybody's personality is a byproduct of how they see themselves and their insistence that they want that self to be portrayed correctly across multiple situations. And you might be sort of on the right track when you really think of his personality theory in that way. But you have to remember really critical components to the phenomenological approach to really appreciate how ridiculously challenging it is to apply this theory when explaining behavior. Remember, in Rogers' idea, every one of us is living in our own worlds. We've got our own perceptions and takes on each situation. We get our own perceptions of how to get the things that we want to obtain out of situations and what behaviors we might display to be seen in a specific way. In essence, if somebody says, I'm a very outgoing and kind person, how that outgoing, kind definition gets manifested in behavior can be dramatically different from person to person. If we really want to apply Rogers' phenomenological approach to any given situation and person's behavior in it, we have a lot to consider. We've got to consider the actor's interpretations of what they're going to do, what they want out of the situations, and there's a general gist of what's right and wrong and how a behavior should be manifested in any given moment. One of my favorite examples of this is now a relatively old musical, but one that when it came out, it was kind of revolutionary at the time. Those of you that haven't seen the musical Wicked yet, I encourage you to watch it some way, shape, or form, either by trying to pull up a video of it online or going to attend a musical to watch it. Because in that musical, we see sort of a transition that started to pick up at around that time, where lots of authors started to explore not just the protagonist in movies, but also the antagonist in movies, the person that was portrayed as the bad person from the original storyteller's perspective. In the movie Wicked, or I guess in the musical Wicked, you get a new take on the situation. You get to see the world from what's considered the bad witch's perspective. You get to see her take on how she interprets each encounter and how she understands herself and her behaviors. And what you get when you get to watch that musical is a much more robust explanation of this tried and true story of the Wizard of Oz that many of us know about. What it also allows you to do is really appreciate how, when we try to explain a person's behaviors, if we imply or apply, sorry, our own biases, our own takes on why somebody would do something or what they would need to do to display specific behavior, we're often going to miss the mark because it's not until we get into the heads of those individuals, assume that they're relatively good people and that they're trying to be seen in a specific way, we really have a good chance of understanding why people do the things they do and predicting what they're going to do in the next situation. So, how do we wrap up this whole idea of Rogers's phenomenological approach? It's a little challenging, honestly, but if we're going to try to do it, I would insist that this particular theory is all about interpretation, all about take. His idea was that most of us are very, very consistent individuals. Most of us are pretty freaking awesome in reality. But for us to understand how we're consistent, how we're awesome, we need to understand everybody's take on themselves, on the world, and their understanding of what they're trying to accomplish and how their behaviors get them to those goals. Most people tend to think of Rogers as the guy that talked a lot about self-actualization and how wonderful we are. That's true to an extent. More importantly, when we're looking at Rogers's view on personality, what we see is a take that assumes that most of our consistency lies in our perceptions, our own perceptions of who we are, what we're like, and how we should behave in situations. It really was dramatically different from any of the other personality theorists that were around at that time, and it made him really this gravitational figure that lots of people flocked to so they could understand his idea better and use components of his idea for their own explanations of what personality was like and what we should explore when understanding individual differences. This is where we're heading. Now that we've covered the work of Rogers and his general theory about how we should try to understand a person, we're going to look at where today's clinical psychologist and personality psychologist sort of utilize some of the components of Rogers' original ideas in their work. We're also going to understand how certain ideas that were prominent in Rogers' theory have branched off into other areas of psychology. We'll look at positive psychology and how this movement came about through the work of Rogers with one of his colleagues in Abraham Maslow. Also talk a little bit about client-centered therapy for just a bit and go into a concept that's really a key part of the positive psychology movement, this idea of something called flow, which again looks at the world and behaviors of a person by taking the perspective of kind of what drives a person and what's going on in their own heads. I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, though. Let's wrap up today just by congratulating you for getting to the end of this very complicated and winding theory, and I'm sure painful recording because I do really hate talking into these microphones, and celebrate the fact that I will be back on Wednesday for our next class, and we'll be able to digest all of these theories that you see listed here. For today, thank you very much for making it through, and apologize that we had to have class in this medium, but it's looking like we'll definitely be able to meet in person on Wednesday since the symptoms of my son are slowly going away as the days progressed here. So thank you very much again, and I hope to see you all very soon. Take care.